Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a whole stack of sources, articles, research, and, well, we try to distill them into the most important actionable insights for you.
That's the plan.
And today, we're plunging into a world-renowned book. I mean, this thing has fundamentally reshaped how people think about productivity, systems, even like our personal lives.
It really has had a huge impact.
Have you ever felt just completely stuck? You know that feeling, like you're pouring all this effort into something, maybe a big project at work, could be a challenging task at home, maybe just getting through your to-do list, but your efforts, they just don't seem to yield the results you expect.
That feeling of spinning your wheels.
Exactly. You feel overwhelmed by problems, especially when things get complex, like in a business, and the outcomes just aren't lining up. Well, today we're diving into a story that offers a really surprising, kind of powerful pathway out of that exact kind of stuckness. It's actually a profound exploration of cause and effect, but it's disguised as this thrilling narrative.
And that story is Eliyahu M. Goldratt's groundbreaking work, The Goal. And you're right, it is so much more than just your typical business book or, management guide.
Right.
Goldratt presents what he calls new global principles of manufacturing, but he does it through this incredibly unique, really engaging format. It's a novel.
A novel, which is, pretty unusual for this kind of topic.
It really is. Imagine that a gripping narrative, and it's interwoven with a plant manager's professional quest, trying to save his factory, and it even includes his personal struggles, his family life, and all of that is meticulously designed to illustrate these incredibly complex yet sort of universally applicable ideas. Goldratt, he firmly believed that the phenomena we see in organizations, the problems, the conflicts, they aren't just random occurrences or like human failings. He saw them as actual phenomena of nature.
Phenomena of nature, that's a strong claim.
It is, but he meant they deserve rigorous scientific understanding. We shouldn't just dismiss them as anecdotal fiction or bad luck. For him, true science is, and I quote him here, nothing more than an understanding of the way the world is and why it is that way.
Okay. So understanding the why.
Exactly. And that knowledge, once you gain it, it should always be pursued, in his view, to make our world better, to make life more fulfilling.
I like that.
And what's really powerful about his approach, and this book in particular, is his insistence that getting this understanding, it requires no exceptional brain power.
Really? That's encouraging.
Yeah. He says it just requires the courage to face inconsistencies and to avoid running away from them just because that's the way it was always done. It's really about questioning the status quo, having the guts to say, wait, does this actually make sense?
That's such a liberating thought, isn't it? That you don't need to be some kind of genius, just, courageous enough to challenge your assumptions. And in The Goal, that courage is definitely tested. It's tested in the crucible of Alex Rogo's life. Alex, he's the plant manager at this company, Unico, and his world is it's spiraling into a mess.
Yeah, things are pretty bad for him at the start.
Picture this. His plant is just a symphony of chaos. We're talking idle machinery over here, while another area is completely swamped, buried in work. There's this constant, overwhelming din, roaring fans, motors, and then these inexplicable booms from equipment that's clearly overworked.
Sounds stressful.
Totally. Plus, there are union disputes brewing, people are upset, stressed out, and the sheer noise and activity of the plant. It's managed by characters like Bob Donovan, the production manager. He's described as this mountain of a man who, make things happen, but often by proclaiming the hell with the rules.
The classic firefighter type.
Exactly. But this overwhelming environment, this constant churn and activity, it actually masks these deeper systemic issues that are literally dragging the entire division down.
Activity doesn't equal progress.
Not at all. And then comes the hammer blow. Alex, his boss, Bill Peach, he gives him this dire ultimatum. You've got 3 months, he says, 3 months to turn this plant around, or it gets shut down, period. Because, as Peach bluntly puts it, the plant is the anchor pulling us in.
Wow. Talk about pressure.
Seriously. So the stakes couldn't possibly be higher for Rogo's journey. He's not just fighting to save a plant. He's fighting for his career, his reputation, and, ultimately his family's future, too, because his home life is suffering. It really is like a high-stakes thriller, but it's wrapped in this incredible management lesson.
It truly is the perfect setup for a story about fundamental change, isn't it? And also about the resistance that change always seems to meet. Alex is just exhausted at the beginning. He's constantly thinking, every 6 months it seems like some group from corporate is coming out with some new program that's the latest panacea to all our problems.
A program of the month club, right?
Yeah, exactly. He says, some of them seem to work, but none of them does any good. He's working incredibly hard, putting in ridiculously long hours. He's practically becoming a stranger to his wife, Julie, and his kids. But genuine, sustainable progress, it just remains elusive.
And that highlights such a universal challenge, doesn't it, that we often face. Working harder just isn't enough if you're not working on the right things, if your efforts aren't actually aligned with the true objective.
That's the crux of it right there.
So Alex Rogo, he's facing this impossible deadline. He's drowning in all these traditional metrics, and he's utterly confused about what the plan's actual purpose is. I mean, he really grapples with these fundamental questions. Is the goal just producing products? Doesn't matter if they sell.
Or is it about sales volume, maybe, even if those sales aren't profitable?
Right. Or is it just gaining market share? He's looking at all the standard reports, efficiencies, cost of products, direct labor variances, and this growing unease starts settling in. He realizes these metrics aren't actually telling him if the plant is truly making money.
The numbers look okay in places, but the plant's dying.
Exactly. He's wrestling with that core question. How do I really know if what happens here is making money for us, or whether we're just playing accounting games? He even briefly considers maybe the goal is just creating jobs, given all the talk of layoffs.
But he quickly dismisses that.
Yeah, he knows the plant wasn't built for the purpose of paying wages and giving people something to do. And he also recognizes that chasing market share at a loss, which Unico apparently did sometimes just to unload inventories, that's equally pointless, maybe even damaging.
It's just shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic.
Pretty much. Yeah. So it becomes glaringly clear to him that these traditional kind of localized metrics, they're not only misleading, but they often incentivize completely counterproductive actions. They lead departments to optimize themselves, but at the expense of the overall system.
And this initial confusion, it's not just a plot point. It's actually a crucial reflection of how so many organizations operate, right? They get fixated on these these departmental goals. It perfectly sets the stage for this profound, paradigm-shifting realization that's about to come.
Yeah, the light bulb moment.
Exactly. And it comes from Alex's chance encounter with his old physics professor, Jonah. They bump into each other at O'Hare Airport, a really serendipitous moment.
Right place, right time.
Totally. And Jonah immediately starts challenging Alex's deeply ingrained assumptions, right from their very first exchange. His core assertion, it sounds incredibly simple, but it's actually profound. He says, the goal of a manufacturing organization is to make money.
Okay, make money. Seems obvious, maybe.
Well, yes and no, because Jonah immediately clarifies this isn't about, arbitrary short-sighted cost-cutting or just boosting one financial metric while ignoring others. He means simultaneously increasing net profit, return on investment, and cash flow. All three together.
Simultaneously. Okay, that's the key.
That's the critical aha moment for Rogo, because it forces him to think about these three financial measures not as separate targets you can trade off, but as interdependent indicators of real, true success. You can't just sacrifice cash flow to boost net profit temporarily or mess up ROI for either and still actually achieve the real goal.
It demands a more holistic view.
Exactly. A system-wide view of financial success, something that was totally missing from Alex's previous way of thinking, which was all about those local efficiencies.
Okay, so if the ultimate goal is making money by improving net profit, ROI, and cash flow all at once, how do you possibly translate that into practical, actionable terms for the plant floor, for the day-to-day stuff?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Jonah provides Alex with 3 new operational measurements. These measurements perfectly express that big financial goal, and crucially, they provide clear rules for actually running the plant.
Okay, operational measures. Let's break those down. What's the first one?
First, there's throughput. Jonah defines this as the rate at which the system generates money through sales.
Through sales?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a key distinction.
Huge distinction. As you heard, sales, not just production. This immediately challenges that conventional thinking. Like you said, you can produce 1,000,000 widgets, but if they're just sitting in a warehouse collecting dust,
You haven't generated any throughput.
not a dime. Throughput is about what the customer actually pays for,
Right.
what truly moves through the system and out the door to a paying customer. It's the rate at which value is actually delivered, and therefore money comes into the organization.
Got it. So throughput is money coming in via sales. What's next?
Second, we have inventory. Jonah defines this as all the money that the system has invested in purchasing things which it intends to sell.
Okay, so raw materials, work in process,
Yep.
finished goods.
Exactly, all of that. Raw materials, WIP, finished goods sitting in the warehouse. But here's a really critical, almost radical detail that's very different from traditional accounting. Jonah deliberately says, I decided to define it this way because I believe it's better not to take the value added into account.
No value added. So no labor cost, no overhead added to the inventory value.
Correct. You don't add labor or overhead costs to the inventory value for this measurement. This simplifies things massively, and crucially, it avoids that common accounting confusion between investment and expense.
Why is that so significant, though? Not adding value.
Because traditional accounting often inflates inventory value by adding labor and overhead. It makes it seem like you're creating value on the books when you're really just piling up goods that haven't sold.
Ah, I see, like fool's gold.
Kind of. Goldratt strips that away. It gives you a much clearer, truer picture of your actual working capital that's tied up in the system. High inventory, under this definition, really highlights potential inefficiencies and delays. It's money stuck in the system.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have throughput, money in via sales, inventory, money stuck inside. What's the third one?
And finally, there's operational expense. Jonah defines this as all the money the system spends in order to turn inventory into throughput.
So basically all the other costs.
Pretty much. This covers everything from direct labor, utilities, depreciation, rent, marketing costs, basically. Anything that's not the raw material itself, but is required to run the system and make sales happen. It's the cost of keeping the lights on, the machines running, paying people.
Yeah.
It's the money that leaves the system to make throughput possible.
Okay, T, I, and OE.
Yeah.
Throughput, inventory, operational expense.
Exactly. And the real power, sort of elegance of these three measurements, T, I, and OE, lies in their critical interdependencies. As Jonah precisely states it, if you want to change one of them, you will have to change at least one of the others as well.
Ah, so you can't just tweak one in isolation. They're linked.
Fundamentally linked. This lays the absolute foundation for thinking about the plant, or really any system, as a whole interconnected thing, rather than just a collection of independent departments doing their own thing. You can't just optimize throughput without it affecting inventory or operational expense, and vice versa. This is a stark contrast to Alex's initial approach, remember, where he was trying to optimize local efficiencies in each department, only to find the whole system spiraling downwards.
Yeah, because those local optimums weren't helping the overall goal.
Exactly. Jonah pushes Alex hard to see that local optimums are not only misleading, they're often actively harmful to the system's goal. The entire plant, every single thing you manage within it, is ultimately covered by these three simple measurements. They become the bedrock for transforming Unico. The core insight here is you must manage the system holistically. Improving a part doesn't automatically improve the whole. Sometimes it makes it worse.
Okay, that framework, TIOE, seems powerful, but maybe a bit abstract still. How does Alex start to really get it, like on a gut level?
Well, right as he's grappling with these new concepts, his personal life is really hitting rock bottom. His wife, Julie, she's deeply frustrated by his constant focus on work, his emotional absence. She actually leaves him temporarily.
Ouch. That's rough.
It is, and it's a painful parallel to the chaos at the plant, you know? His marriage is drifting apart, just like the plant seems to be failing. It's a powerful way the book illustrates how these principles apply beyond just the factory floor.
So his personal crisis mirrors the professional one.
Exactly. But this personal crisis, it actually leads to a truly, well, fortuitous analogy for understanding the plant's problems. Alex finds himself having to step in and lead his son Davy's Boy Scout troop on an overnight hike. What starts out as just another chore he doesn't have time for, it quickly turns into this profound, real-world model for understanding exactly what's wrong at his plant.
The Boy Scout hike, how does that work?
It's just a brilliant narrative device Goldratt uses. It illustrates these complex concepts without resorting to a bunch of jargon. Alex himself quickly has this realization, thinking, this troop of boys is analogous to a manufacturing system. We produce walk trail.
Huh. Walk trail, I like that.
Yeah. It provides this really intuitive, accessible framework for understanding two critical phenomena that Jonah had described earlier: dependent events and statistical fluctuations.
Okay, dependent events and statistical fluctuations. Let's unpack those.
Sure. Dependent events are simply activities that must occur in sequence. One thing has to happen before the next thing can happen. On the hike, it's simple. One boy has to walk ahead before the next boy can move into that same space on the trail. Each step depends on the one before it. You can't have the last boy suddenly teleport to the front.
Okay, makes sense, like an assembly line.
Exactly like an assembly line. Then you have statistical fluctuations. These are just the natural, random variations in performance that happen all the time. On the hike, some boys naturally walk faster, some walk slower, some pause to adjust their packs, someone stops to tie a shoe, maybe someone gets distracted by a butterfly. There's this inherent variability in how quickly each person, or you could say each machine or workstation, performs its tasks.
Right, nothing ever runs at the exact same speed constantly.
Yeah, precisely. And here's where it gets really interesting and actually quite counterintuitive for many people. On the hike, Alex watches closely what happens when you combine these two things: dependent events in a sequence plus statistical fluctuations in performance.
Okay, what happens?
The crucial insight, the big takeaway, is that these fluctuations do not average out in a sequence like you might expect.
They don't average out, so if someone goes slow, someone else going fast doesn't just cancel it out.
Not in a dependent sequence, no. Instead, the negative fluctuations, the delays, the slower performances, they accumulate downstream. Think about it. If one boy slows down significantly, the boy behind him catches up and has to slow down too. Then the next boy, and the next. The delay ripples backwards. But if a boy goes faster for a bit, the boy behind him can't magically go faster than his own pace or pass the person ahead easily. So the gains are often lost or constrained, but the losses pile up.
Ah, I see. The slowdowns have a bigger impact down the line.
Exactly. The whole line stretches out, creating gaps. That's like inventory building up between stations. The boys at the front, meanwhile, they walk faster for a bit, but eventually they might have to stop and wait for the others to catch up or they get too far ahead. So you get inventory, these gaps in the line, boys waiting, and the entire system, the whole troop, slows down to the pace of the slowest element or experiences these big gaps and pileups.
So the variability causes bottlenecks in inventory.
Yes. And this is powerfully reinforced later in the book with the dice game illustration. That game clearly shows how even if each step has the same average output, like rolling a die, the upstream fluctuations, sometimes rolling high, sometimes rolling low, starve the downstream operations. The result is always overall underperformance compared to the theoretical average, and inventory piles up in front of the constrained steps.
Right, because a station can't process more than it receives, even if it could go faster sometimes.
Exactly. The fundamental truth Goldratt hammers home is that variability, when combined with dependencies, always leads to decreased throughput and increased inventory, unless you specifically manage it. You can't just assume things will average out. You can't make up for a slow moment in a sequence just by having a fast moment later. The delay is already baked into the system downstream.
Wow. Okay. That really changes how you look at flow.
It absolutely does. And this accumulated effect of dependent events plus statistical fluctuations, it leads Alex directly to the discovery of Herbie.
Herbie. The famous Herbie. Tell us about Herbie.
Okay, so on the hike, Herbie is this one poor kid who is consistently the slowest. He's lagging behind, holding everyone up. And when Alex investigates, he finds Herbie is weighed down by this impossibly heavy backpack. It's filled with ridiculous things. He thought he needed extra sodas, cans of spaghetti, even a heavy iron skillet.
An iron skillet? Seriously?
Seriously. So Herbie, poor kid, quite literally becomes the troop's bottleneck. He is the constraint that is limiting the entire system's throughput, which is, walking the trail.
He's the slowest part, so he sets the pace for everyone.
Exactly. The revelation for Alex is crystal clear. The troop's overall speed is dictated solely by Herbie's speed. And, here's the kicker, counterintuitively, piling more weight onto Herbie by trying to make him carry even more, or just having the other boys try to push him along faster. That only slows the entire system down further, because he just becomes more burdened and even less efficient.
Right, you're making the bottleneck worse.
Precisely. This is where Alex fully grasps Jonah's point, thinking, The idea is not to see who can get there the fastest. The idea is to get there together. The entire system, whether it's a troop of scouts marching or a complex manufacturing plant producing goods, it only moves as fast as its slowest part, its constraint, its Herbie.
That simple analogy from the hike gives him this deep, intuitive understanding.
It really does. It reveals where the true leverage points are in any complex system. It's not about making everyone faster. It's about managing the slowest part.
So, armed with this almost visceral understanding from the hike, Alex races back to the plant. He's energized, right? Ready to apply what he's learned.
Absolutely. He's got a framework now. And his very first step in what Jonah later codifies as the 5 focusing steps of the theory of constraints is step 1, identify the constraints.
Find the Herbie in the plant.
Exactly. After some pretty rigorous analysis, they dig through old production records, even using old punch cards at one point. But crucially, they also just go out and observe the operations, watching where the inventory piles up. He and his team pinpoint 2 Herbies in his plant.
2 of them.
Yeah, it's often 1 or 2 key resources. In this case, it's the NCX-10 machine, which is a sophisticated, expensive piece of equipment, and the entire heat treat department, specifically the furnaces. Both of these are constantly overloaded with work, with huge piles of materials awaiting in front of them.
Okay, so those are the bottlenecks. Everything upstream is piling up waiting for them, and everything downstream is probably starved for work from them.
That's exactly the situation. They are holding everything else back.
So, step 1, identify. What's step 2?
Once the constraints are identified, the next absolutely crucial step is step 2. Decide how to exploit the constraint.
Exploit them. What does that mean exactly?
It means making absolutely sure that those bottlenecks, the NCX-10 and heat treat, are never idle for a single moment if you can possibly help it. Not for a coffee break, not for a lunch break if someone else can step in, not waiting for materials, not down for a setup change that could have been avoided or shortened. Every second of bottleneck time is incredibly precious.
Because that's the time that dictates the whole plant's output.
Precisely. And this is where that shocking revelation comes in about the cost of a bottleneck hour. Lou, the plant controller, who's initially very skeptical of all this, he does the math. His first calculation comes out to an astounding $2,735 per hour of lost bottleneck time.
Wait, over $2,700 an hour?
Huh? Yeah. He later refines it down to $2,188, but still, it's huge. This figure isn't based on the cost of running the machine itself, like electricity or the operator's wage. It's derived from the total throughput, the value of the finished goods sold that the entire plant loses if that bottleneck isn't producing parts that are needed for those sales, divided by the bottleneck's available operating hours.
Wow, so it's an opportunity cost for the whole system.
Exactly. And this stands in incredibly stark contrast to the minimal direct labor cost assigned to making a single part on that machine, which might be, say, 32 baht or $21 in the book's examples.
That comparison just blows traditional cost accounting out of the water.
Completely. It illuminates how a seemingly small local efficiency loss at the bottleneck, maybe an extra hour of downtime, can be a system-wide disaster, literally costing the entire company thousands of dollars in lost throughput, lost sales. It fundamentally changes how you have to think about managing those critical resources. Every single minute of bottleneck time is gold, not just for that machine, but for the company's bottom line.
Okay, that's a massive shift in perspective. So, how do they actually exploit these bottlenecks? What practical things do they do to prevent any idle time?
They implement several key actions pretty quickly. First, they make a rule. Prioritize quality control before the bottleneck.
Check parts before they get to the NCX-10 or heat treat.
Yes. As Jonah explains it with stark clarity, if you scrap a part before it reaches the bottleneck, all you have lost is a scrapped part. Plus, maybe a little bit of material and prior work. Minimal loss. But, he says, if you scrap the part after it's past the bottleneck, you have lost time on the bottleneck that cannot be recovered.
Ah, because you wasted precious bottleneck capacity on something that ends up being useless.
Exactly. So this means ensuring that those expensive, time-critical bottleneck machines only ever work on good, defect-free parts. Prevent them from wasting their limited, valuable capacity on stuff that's going to end up in the scrap bin anyway.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
What else?
Second, they focus intensely on shifting work. They look at everything the bottlenecks are doing and ask, does this have to be done here? For example, they find that the NCX10 machine could do certain processes, but those processes weren't critical and could actually be done maybe less efficiently but adequately on other non-bottleneck machines.
So offload anything that doesn't absolutely require the bottleneck's unique capabilities.
Right. Free up its time for the stuff only it can do or the stuff that gates the most throughput. They even start considering outsourcing certain parts or operations if it means freeing up bottleneck capacity, even if the per-part cost of outsourcing initially seems higher on paper.
Because the value of that freed up bottleneck hour is so immense.
Precisely. It's all about maximizing the bottleneck's productive value-generating time, because that's where the system's overall capacity is truly created and constrained.
Okay, identify, exploit. What's step 3?
Building directly on exploitation, the third step is step 3. Subordinate everything else to the above decisions. That is, subordinate all non-bottleneck resources to the bottleneck.
Subordinate, meaning make them serve the bottleneck.
Exactly. And this is perhaps the most radical, the most counterintuitive shift in mindset for many traditional managers, like Bob Donovan in the book. It means that non-bottlenecks, the machines or departments that have excess capacity, should not be running at their full capacity all the time, if doing so means either starving the bottleneck, not getting parts to it when it's ready, or, more commonly, overfeeding it, piling up huge amounts of inventory in front of it.
So you might actually want to deliberately slow down the non-bottlenecks.
Yes. Alex makes a really controversial decision to deliberately restrict the release of material into the system, specifically timing the release so that it arrives at the bottleneck just in time, not way too early. They implement a system, initially with red and green tags, to signal priorities based on bottleneck needs.
I can imagine that didn't go over well initially.
Yeah.
Slowing things down.
Yeah.
Telling people not to work.
Oh, it absolutely didn't. This initially makes the reported efficiencies in those non-bottleneck departments fall dramatically according to the old metrics. Managers like Bob Donovan are understandably uneasy, even furious at first. They're used to being measured on keeping their machines running and their people busy.
Because that's how they've always been judged.
Right. But this deliberate throttling, this subordination, it ultimately allows the overall throughput for the entire plant to rise significantly. The plant shifts from, as Alex puts it, running the plant by the seat of the pants, where every machine just ran flat out trying to look busy, creating mountains of unneeded work in process, WIP.
Which just tied up catch and hid problems.
Exactly. It shifts from that chaos to a coordinated, deliberate flow, where the pace of the entire system is now consciously set by the capacity of the bottleneck. It's a really challenging management move because it directly confronts those deeply ingrained beliefs about keeping every worker and every machine busy all the time.
But the logic is sound. If a non-bottleneck processes parts faster than the bottleneck can consume them, it only creates inventory that just sits there, tying up cash, increasing lead times, and not actually generating any sales.
You got it. That pile of inventory doesn't help you meet the goal.
Okay. Identify, exploit, subordinate. That seems like a powerful sequence already. Is there more?
There is. Once you've fully exploited the constraint and subordinated everything else to it, if you still need more capacity from the system, you move to the fourth step. Step 4. Elevate the constraint.
Elevate. So this is where you actually increase the bottleneck's capacity, like buying a new machine.
That's one way, yes, but it's often the last resort because it usually involves significant capital investment. The key insight here is to get creative and find ways to increase the bottleneck's capacity without necessarily making massive, costly investments first.
So look for smarter ways before spending big money.
Exactly. They get incredibly creative at Alex's plant. For instance, remember how crucial bottleneck time is. They start assigning their very best, most skilled, most reliable people to operate and maintain the bottlenecks. As Alex declares, from now on, we put only our best people to work on the bottlenecks.
Why does that help elevate capacity?
Because better operators often mean higher quality output, less scrap produced at the bottleneck, fewer mistakes, maybe slightly faster cycle times, and critically, less unexpected downtime. They also ensure the machines are maintained proactively.
Makes sense. Keep the crucial resource running smoothly.
Right. They also implement dedicated setup crews specifically for machines like the NCX10. Instead of the operator doing the lengthy setup, a specialized crew does it, drastically reducing the setup and changeover times. This means the machine spends significantly more time actually producing parts, effectively elevating its capacity.
Okay, reducing downtime. Clever.
And in the heat treat department, they come up with a simple but brilliant engineering solution. They create interchangeable furnace tables. This simple change saves us a couple of hours a day on the time it took to switch between batches requiring different treatments. That seemingly small time saving allows them to process an extra heat of parts over the course of a week, which is a direct increase in bottleneck throughput.
Wow. Small changes, big impact on the constraint.
Exactly. And they also strategically use outsourcing. They identify that sending some of the excess heat treating work to an outside vendor, even though, as Lou calculates, going outside would increase our cost per part locally for those specific parts.
But the overall system gain is worth it.
Far, far greater, because the increased throughput and revenue generated for the entire plant by relieving that bottleneck pressure massively outweighs the marginal increase in local costs for the outsourced parts. It allows them to sell more overall.
So the key with elevation is to do it only when exploitation and subordination aren't enough to meet demand, and to be really strategic and creative about how you do it, looking for low-cost, high-impact solutions first.
That's the essence of it. You don't jump to buying new equipment if you haven't fully squeezed every bit of potential out of what you already have and aligned the rest of the system to support it.
So after implementing these first 4 steps, identify, exploit, subordinate, elevate what happens at Alex's plant. Do things actually get better?
Oh, do they ever? The beauty is really in the combination and the systematic application of these steps together. The results are almost immediate and incredibly dramatic. Alex's plant experiences a truly rapid turnaround. They managed to ship 57 customer orders with a value of a cool $3 million.
57 orders. $3 million. Wasn't their previous record much lower?
It's much lower. Their previous best month ever was 31 orders worth about $2 million. So this is a massive jump, almost double the number of orders shipped and a 50% increase in revenue value, all achieved relatively quickly by focusing the entire system around the bottlenecks.
That must have felt amazing for the team.
Absolutely. And crucially, this initial, very tangible triumph provides vital validation from Bill Peach, Alex's boss. He acknowledges it, maybe grudgingly at first, but acknowledges it as a definite step in the right direction.
Buys them some breathing room.
Exactly. And more importantly, it proves pretty unequivocally to Alex, his team, and even the skeptics that focusing on the constraint, managing the system holistically using T, I, and OE, rather than just chasing those illusory local efficiencies, is the true path to real financial and operational improvement for the entire system.
Okay, so huge initial success. But the journey doesn't just end there, right? I mean, you don't just fix one bottleneck and declare victory forever.
Not at all. In fact, Goldratt makes it incredibly clear that true improvement is a continuous, ongoing process. This brings us to the 5th and arguably the most crucial step in the theory of constraints. Step 5. If in the previous steps a constraint has been broken, go back to step 1, but do not allow inertia to set in.
Okay, so if you elevate a bottleneck enough, it might not be the bottleneck anymore.
Exactly. Success in elevating one constraint often leads to new problems, or rather, reveals the next constraint in the system. Alex learns this lesson pretty quickly. With the significant increase in throughput they achieve by managing the NCX-10 and heat treat, they've now loaded the rest of the plant to a level where they've run out of capacity on some other resources.
Ah, so the bottleneck shifted somewhere else.
Precisely. As Jonah warns, we've created a new bottleneck. We see this unfold dramatically with the flawed green tags and red tags priority system that Alex's team initially implements.
I remember that. What went wrong there?
Well, while it was designed to prioritize parts that needed to go through the original bottlenecks, NCX-10 heat treat, it didn't account for the capacity of the new bottlenecks that emerged downstream. This inadvertently created new delays and unplanned overtime for other products. Even while the overall throughput was still higher than before, parts were getting stuck again, just in different places.
So the priority system itself became a kind of constraint.
You could say the lack of adaptation in the priority system or the failure to quickly identify the new constraints became the issue. This is such a critical lesson. Once a constraint is broken or elevated, new ones will inevitably emerge because the system's internal dynamics have fundamentally changed.
And that's where the warning about inertia comes in.
Yes. The importance of not allowing organizational inertia to set in is paramount. As Jonah cautions, whenever the constraint is broken, it changes conditions to the extent that it is very dangerous to extrapolate from the past. You absolutely cannot just assume that what worked before, the priorities or procedures you had in place, will still work now, because the system has fundamentally shifted.
You have to constantly reevaluate. Go back to step one. Identify the new constraint.
Exactly. It's a dynamic, ongoing process of adapting and iterating. It's not a one-shot deal.
This constant dynamism, the shifting of bottlenecks, does it bring other concepts into focus?
It really does. One major one that comes up is the critical importance of smaller batch sizes.
Smaller batches. But isn't it usually considered more efficient to run large batches to minimize setup times per part?
That's the traditional thinking, based on minimizing local cost per operation. But Alex and his team start to realize that while larger batches might seem efficient locally, fewer setups, they significantly increase the total time from the moment the material comes into the plant to the minute it goes out the door.
Right.
The overall lead time.
The time it takes to get paid, basically.
Right. Alex breaks down this total lead time into 4 key elements. Setup time, time spent preparing a machine. Process time, time actually working on the part. Queue time, time spent waiting in line before an operation because the resource is busy. And wait time, time spent waiting after an operation, usually for the rest of the batch to be finished before moving.
Queue and wait time. That sounds like where inventory sits around.
Exactly. And large batches massively inflate queue and wait times. Material just sits there waiting for a full batch to be accumulated, or waiting for a machine tied up on a long run, or waiting for the rest of the batch to finish before the first piece can move on.
So smaller batches would reduce that waiting time.
Dramatically. Smaller batches, counterintuitively perhaps, significantly reduce both queue and wait times, even if it means doing slightly more setups overall. This leads to much faster flow through the entire system, quicker response to customer orders, and drastically lower work-in-process inventory.
Less cash tied up, faster delivery. Sounds good. But what about the cost? Doesn't doing more setups increase costs?
That's what Lou, the controller, initially worries about. But he discovers something profound. The cost of parts has gone down since we began the smaller batch sizes.
Down. How?
Because, as he explains, the same burden overhead costs, the same direct labor cost, is now spread over more product. By making and selling significantly more finished product within the same time period because of the faster flow, with roughly the same operational expense, labor, overhead, the allocated cost per unit effectively decreases. Plus, they're freeing up cash by reducing inventory.
Wow. So faster flow actually leads to lower unit costs and higher net profit, even with more setups. That's a complete flip from traditional cost accounting wisdom.
It absolutely is. It prioritizes system flow and throughput over localized cost minimization, which is often misleading.
This focus on flow and managing constraints, it must require better information, right? Not just piles of data.
Definitely. And this leads to a great transformation for Ralph Nakamura, the data processing manager, who was initially pretty skeptical and overwhelmed. He takes a huge step forward by developing a new predictive system. It's based on real-time data from the bottlenecks, knowing their capacity, the sequence of jobs, and the buffer levels.
A predictive system. What can it do?
This system can now predict, with reasonable accuracy, often within 24 hours, when any specific customer order will actually ship. This is revolutionary for them.
I bet. That's huge for customer service and sales.
Massive. It transforms this raw, overwhelming data they used to have into actionable information. Ralph himself comes to define information brilliantly as the answer to the question asked. Customers want to know when they'll get their order. This system provides that answer.
And that must have been incredibly empowering for Ralph, too.
Hugely, he notes, feeling a new sense of purpose. People really need me now, and I feel like I'm contributing. It's a great illustration of how the impact of TOC ripples through an entire organization. It's not just about production. It aligns different functions like data processing, sales, and marketing around the true goal and provides the tools they need to support it.
So all these improvements, identifying and managing constraints, smaller batches, better information, it sounds like they're really building a system for continuous improvement.
That's exactly what they're doing, whether they fully label it that way at first or not. They are truly embarking on what Goldratt formally calls the process of ongoing improvement, POG.
POG. Catchy acronym.
It is. And it's the true heart of the theory of constraints. It signifies the continuous, relentless application of those 5 focusing steps we discussed. It is absolutely not a one-time fix or a project with a defined end date. It's a way of managing, a way of thinking.
There's a process, not a destination.
Precisely. Bob Donovan, the Gruff production manager, actually has this moment of insight mixed with frustration where he shouts something like, "You know what? I think the real sneaky SOB in all this is the first one.
The first step, identify the constraint.
No, the first word in Pile, process. He realizes the core challenge isn't just finding the initial constraint or even the subsequent ones. The real challenge, the sneaky part, is embedding this continuous process of questioning, challenging assumptions, adapting, and improving into the culture. It's about never being satisfied, always looking for the next limitation, the next opportunity. It's a dynamic, iterative cycle of learning and adapting. It's about building a culture of systemic problem solving.
That makes sense. The hard part is keeping it going, not just the initial breakthrough.
Right. And as Alex ultimately gets promoted and moves into a new, higher-level corporate role, he's suddenly tasked with managing several plants and divisions. His new challenge becomes teaching these principles to others, getting buy-in across a wider organization.
And that introduces a whole new set of obstacles, I imagine.
Absolutely. This is where the book really highlights the profound hurdle of overcoming resistance to change. You run smack into those deeply ingrained practices, that pervasive, well, that's the way it was always done around here, mindset.
The ultimate constraint, maybe. Inertia.
Could be. Alex finds himself leaning heavily into a Socratic method, just like Jonah used with him. He starts asking questions rather than just giving answers, trying to gently guide people to discover the inconsistencies in their own logic, peeling away the layers of common practice and often faulty assumptions.
Leading them to their own conclusions.
Exactly. He even draws this fascinating analogy to Mendeleev and the development of the periodic table of elements. He explains that Mendeleev's breakthrough wasn't just listing elements, it was about finding the intrinsic order, the underlying principles that govern their relationships. True classification, Alex argues, isn't arbitrary or based on superficial categories like, say, listing things alphabetically. It's rooted in understanding the fundamental cause and effect relationships.
So applying that to management means finding the real structure, the real drivers, not just looking at surface symptoms or traditional department boundaries.
Precisely. As Goldratt puts it through Jonah, common sense is not common at all. Meaning that what seems obvious or logical on the surface often isn't when you really peel back the layers and discover the underlying structure and assumptions.
You have to dig deeper to find that intrinsic order.
That's the idea. Goldratt saw this as central to a more scientific approach to management. Scientists uncover intrinsic order in nature. Managers need to apply that same rigorous scientific thinking, identifying cause and effect to their organizations. It's about moving beyond just reacting to superficial observations and really understanding the fundamental relationships within the system.
And we see this really changing people at the plant, don't we? Like Lou, the controller.
Oh, absolutely. Lou's transformation is profound. Remember how obsessed he was with traditional cost accounting? He has this incredible personal realization later on. He digs into the numbers and discovers that despite the official reports showing only modest profit increases, the plant's actual net profit was well over 20% in the recent months.
20%? How did the official numbers miss that?
Because the massive reduction in inventory, which freed up huge amounts of cash and represented real improvement, was actually being booked as a loss or a negative variance under their traditional accounting rules. Inventory reduction looked bad on paper, even though it was incredibly good for the business's health.
Wow, that's accounting getting in the way of reality.
Totally. And this stunning revelation completely changes Lou. It drives him to enthusiastically declare he wants to devise a new measurement system and correct the system we have now, because he finally sees how deeply flawed and misleading the traditional metrics were. He gets it.
And Bob Donovan, the production guy.
Bob's perspective also shifts dramatically, especially after they successfully land and execute that huge, supposedly impossible Burnside order. He sees firsthand how focusing production around the constraint actually engineered a sale they could promise and deliver much faster than the competition, winning the business and making a huge profit. He starts to see the connections between production, sales, and the bottom line in a way he never did before.
So these personal transformations really underscore that TOC isn't just like a set of tools or techniques. It's a fundamental shift in thinking.
Exactly. It's a way of thinking that empowers individuals at all levels to see the bigger picture, to understand how their local actions impact the global goal, and to align those actions accordingly.
Okay, so the story within Unico is incredible. The dramatic turnaround, people changing their whole way of thinking. It sounds amazing for a factory floor for manufacturing, but realistically, can these principles, constraints, throughput, the 5 steps, can they truly apply beyond widgets and machines? Is the goal really universally applicable to any complex system?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, based on decades of applications since the book came out, is a resounding yes, absolutely. The power of the theory of constraints lies precisely in its universality. Because the underlying logic, things like identifying dependencies, understanding variation, finding the leverage point, the way you ask questions to uncover the real constraint, those thinking processes are applicable everywhere.
It's about the logic, not the specific context.
Exactly. It's about understanding how systems work, period. Regardless of what they produce, whether it's cars, software, healthcare services, or even educational outcomes, or what industry they operate in, maybe we can look at some real-world examples to illustrate that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's see it in action elsewhere.
Okay, well, consider Dow Corning. There's data showing how one of their plants, applying these principles systematically, achieved incredible results just within Alex's unit in the story, which was based on real implementations. They saw things like a cycle time reduction of approximately 85%.
85%. So products just flew through the plant comparatively.
Right. Operator headcount reductions of 35%, but significantly through attrition, meaning no layoffs, just optimizing the existing staff more effectively. Work in process and finished goods inventory down about 70%.
70% less cash tied up in inventory.
Huge. On-time delivery went from around 50% to over 90%, which is massive for customer satisfaction and competitiveness. And even the number of material handling steps were cut by over half. This wasn't just tweaking one thing. The entire plant and business unit thrived by identifying and managing their constraints, leading to drastic improvements in global metrics across the board.
Those numbers are genuinely staggering. And it's not just about fixing existing processes, right? You mentioned GM.
Yeah, Kevin Coles from General Motors talked about using TOC concepts proactively for designing whole manufacturing processes to make sure they're better from the start. He told this fascinating story about a new vehicle program where they were installing this fuzzy felt-like material in car ceilings. Initial data, the standard reports, suggested that frequent machine failures were the bottleneck causing delays. Looked like an equipment problem.
Right, blame the machine.
But when they applied TOC thinking, actually going and observing the process, focusing on the flow, not just trusting the aggregated data they discovered, the true constraint wasn't machine failure at all. The machine was often idle simply because the operator was waiting for more parts.
Waiting for parts. Why?
Because of inefficient batching. The bulky material had to be hand-fed, and the way they were supplying it created gaps. The operator ran out, and the machine sat idle. It's such a powerful example of how looking beyond the obvious symptoms, beyond the standard reports, and focusing on the actual flow reveals the real constraint. It wasn't the machine's reliability, it was the material flow to the machine.
Wow. Seeing's of believing, I guess.
It really is. And this applies in wildly different industries, too. Think about book manufacturing. Very different from cars. There's a case study from Thomson Shore, a book printing company. Their vice president of finance, Craig Mead, he read the goal, saw the wisdom, and actually made it mandatory reading for all 280 employees, top to bottom.
Mandatory reading for everyone. That's commitment.
It shows how fundamental he thought it was. Their main problems were things you hear a lot: inconsistent on-time delivery and this pervasive department-type mentality where each area just optimized itself without thinking about the whole flow.
Silos.
Exactly. They identified their press room as the primary constraint, the bottleneck for the whole printing process. Then they systematically subordinated everything else to the press room's needs, breaking down those departmental barriers. They even created their own internal training course to teach everyone constraint management, subordination, flowing work, and removing localized thought processes.
So they actively taught people to think systemically.
Yes. And interestingly, Mead, being the finance VP, was instrumental in developing new measurement tools that specifically moved away from traditional, often misleading, cost per unit models. It really proves that TOC is as much about financial understanding and measurement as it is about operational flow. You need both aligned.
That's a huge cultural shift, getting an entire company, including finance, aligned like that. Any other really dramatic examples?
Well, there's a story from Steve West, a manufacturing consultant. He talked about this paradox he experienced. He'd initially paid a consulting firm $120,000 for process improvements, and they worked. They brought lead times down significantly.
Okay, sounds like success. What's the paradox?
The paradox was sales then increased by 40%, spurred by the better lead times. But this huge influx of orders completely nullified the improvements. They were right back where they started, swamped with long lead times again.
So the constraint shifted. The market demand became the constraint, overwhelming the improved process.
Exactly. He realized the problem wasn't just the internal process anymore. But then, armed with TOC thinking, he applied the principles himself, focusing on managing the new constraint, which was likely a mix of market interface and maybe some internal capacity again. And he did it with minimal cost, just $500 apparently, maybe for some basic materials or analysis tools.
$500 versus $120,000. What was the result?
The result: same resources, 40% more orders processed, a fraction of the lead time. This company, which was 100 years old, had, quote, the best 2 quarters that they've ever had. And one particular division that had been consistently losing $1 million a month was suddenly making $1 million a month.
Losing $1 million to making $1 million. That's unbelievable.
It's an incredible testament to the sheer leverage you can gain by correctly identifying and then exploiting, subordinating, and elevating the true system constraint, wherever it happens to be.
Okay, manufacturing, printing. What about service industries?
Mm-hmm.
Like office supplies or banking?
Great question. Peter Hopner shared a story about an office supply company. They applied TOC and realized their constraint wasn't their production or warehouse capacity. It was actually the market specifically, how customers consumed supplies inefficiently.
How customers consume supplies. How is that a constraint?
They found companies were overordering or experiencing, theft or shrinkage because supplies were just freely available. So the office supply company revolutionized their distribution model. They started providing locked cabinets in their client offices, stocked based on actual need, refilled regularly. This prevented the overconsumption.
So they managed the customer's inventory, basically.
Essentially, yes. The result: their clients found the total cost of providing office supplies for their workers dropped by 50%. This made the service incredibly attractive. Later, the constraint shifted internally to their capacity to install these cabinets fast enough to meet demand, which is a much better problem to have. It allowed them to grow at the pace we wanted to grow.
Managing the constraint allowed controlled growth. What about banking? That seems very different.
Rob Pratt discussed applying TOC in banking. They faced regulatory constraints, market constraints. But by digging deeper, they identified their true constraint was often in their internal service levels and how we were solving problems for our customers. By focusing on improving those core service processes, streamlining them based on TOC, they could offer better, faster service, effectively creating personal banking for everybody, which became a competitive advantage. It was about optimizing the customer interaction flow.
So even in a highly regulated service industry, focusing on the internal process constraint makes a difference. What about healthcare? That's often cited as having huge systemic problems.
Absolutely. Andrea Veltman described a powerful example from a hospital clinic. They were struggling with massive patient waiting lists, people waiting 8 or 9 months for appointments.
Yeah, that sounds depressingly familiar for specialist care.
Right. Using TOC, they analyzed the system. Their constraint wasn't a lack of doctors or rooms or equipment. It was lost capacity whenever patients or doctors wouldn't show up for their scheduled appointments. That scheduled slot, once missed, was unrecoverable time, lost throughput for the clinic. That was their IRB.
The no-shows were the bottleneck.
Effectively, the lost appointment slots represented the bottleneck capacity. So their ingenious solution was implementing a simple patient buffer. Basically, a carefully managed call-in list of patients willing to come in on short notice if there was a cancellation.
So they could fill the gaps immediately.
Exactly. By actively managing and filling those gaps, they drastically increased their actual throughput of patient visits without needing any additional doctors or resources initially. The result: they cut the waiting list from 8 months down to less than 4 months within just 6 months.
Wow. That's life-changing for patients waiting in pain or uncertainty.
Absolutely. It's about ensuring the critical resource, the appointment slot, in this case, is always productive, always utilized.
Okay, one more, maybe even more surprising area: education. How can TOC possibly apply in a classroom?
Kathy Sewer, an educator, shared some incredibly moving stories about using TOC, particularly the thinking processes like cause and effect logic, with students. She worked with at-risk students and told a story about one boy who literally couldn't even start drawing a cause and effect logic branch diagram because, as he told her, "This is the first time I've ever thought of something ahead of time."
Wow. TOC was literally teaching him proactive, structured thinking.
Yes. It gave him a tool to think systematically about consequences. With incarcerated youth, they used TOC logic tools to help them analyze their situations. In one case, a group identified jealous people, often meaning peers still involved in gangs who resented them trying to leave, as the primary constraint, the main obstacle to achieving a better life on the outside. Recognizing that explicitly helped them strategize.
That's powerful. Using logic to navigate complex social situations.
And it wasn't just for struggling students. She found that even for affluent, high-achieving students, TOC could make learning make sense by revealing the underlying logic and connections between subjects, rather than just rote memorization. It helped unleash their potential, especially for those who might otherwise get bored.
So these examples, from manufacturing to healthcare to education, they really drive home that the core principles identifying constraints, understanding dependencies and variation, focusing effort, they are truly universal. They apply to any complex human system where you're trying to achieve a goal.
Exactly. These diverse case studies really demonstrate that the principles are not bound by industry or context. It's not about the specific widgets or services. It's about the underlying logic of how systems behave and how to find the leverage point to improve them.
Okay, let's bring it back to Alex Rogo for a moment, because his personal transformation throughout the goal is almost as powerful and illustrative as the plant's turnaround, isn't it?
It really is. It grounds the whole story. When his wife Julie finally returns and they start to actually communicate again, properly communicate, they have these deep discussions about, well, the goal of a marriage. And it mirrors the breakthroughs he experienced at the plant.
Oh, so...
Julie poignantly observes at one point, "For a long time, we have just been coasting along. In fact, we were drifting apart." Alex has this moment of realization that just as the plant was drifting aimlessly without a clear goal or a real understanding of its constraints, so was his marriage.
The parallel is clear.
Very clear. He starts to see that applying logical thinking to personal relationships isn't cold or calculating. It means consciously identifying and addressing the constraints. Maybe it's communication, maybe it's shared goals, maybe it's time together, maybe it's demonstrating love and commitment. It's about ensuring they're not just, as Julie puts it, living in a perfect house where everything happens according to a clock, but are actively working on their relationship, nurturing it.
So, just like the plant needed constant attention to its constraints, the marriage does too. It's about being present, identifying issues, tackling them together.
Exactly. It's about applying that same principle of continuous attention and improvement that he learned painstakingly on the factory floor.
And this journey of improvement, it really never ends, does it? For Alex or for any of us.
No, it doesn't. His promotion at the end, where he's managing several plants and wrestling with the bigger question of what techniques are needed for effective management across a whole division, it highlights that the process of ongoing improvement, POJOY, is truly continuous.
Is facing new, bigger constraints now.
Right. And significantly, he no longer has Jonah physically there, guiding him step by step, providing the answers. Instead, what Jonah has instilled in him through that relentless, question-based Socratic approach is the ability to think critically for himself, to constantly challenge assumptions, to push himself and his teams to find the solutions, rather than just waiting to be given answers.
He learned how to think, not just what to think.
That's the profound, lasting value of Goldratt's teaching, I believe. It's not just about giving you a 5-step recipe. It's about cultivating an independent, systemic, problem-solving mindset.
So wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you, the listener? Whether you're managing a team, running a business, trying to improve a hospital system, or maybe just trying to optimize your own personal life and projects. The goal really seems to provide this practical, yet incredibly profound framework for anyone grappling with complex problems. The actionable insights seem clear and powerful.
They really are. Let's maybe recap some of the big ones.
First, it seems absolutely crucial to identify the real goal. Like, what are you truly trying to achieve? How do you define ultimate success? Whether that's making money, having a better quality of life, reducing patient wait times, finishing a PhD, whatever it is, define it clearly and holistically. Don't get sidetracked by fragmented local metrics that don't align with that ultimate goal.
Absolutely fundamental. Second, understand your system. Don't get lost down in the weeds of local efficiencies or departmental silos. You have to see the interconnectedness of dependent events, where one step absolutely relies on another, and accept the reality of statistical fluctuations, that inherent variability in performance. And critically understand that negative fluctuations tend to accumulate in sequence. They don't just average out.
Third, you've got to find your Herbie. Find that constraint. Identify the single bottleneck, the one limiting factor that is currently holding back your entire system's throughput, the thing that dictates the overall pace of progress towards your goal. That's your point of maximum leverage, and it's often not what you initially think it is.
Once you find it, fourth, focus your energy relentlessly on that constraint. This really involves those 2 key sub-steps from the 5 focusing steps. Exploit the constraint, squeeze every bit of productive capacity out of it, make sure it's always working effectively on the right things, never idle unnecessarily, maximizing its valuable output, and then subordinate everything else to it. This is crucial. Adjust the pace and priorities of all the non-constraints so they perfectly support the bottleneck. Feed it exactly what it needs, when it needs it. Don't let them overproduce and pile up inventory, and don't let them starve it. Don't let perceived local efficiencies anywhere else undermine the global goal dictated by the constraint.
Fifth, elevate the constraint strategically. Only after you've fully exploited and subordinated, if you still need more system capacity, then you look to elevate, to increase the constraint's capacity. But be smart and creative about it. Look for ways to offload work, assign your best people, find innovative methods or simple process improvements to boost its output before you jump to expensive solutions like buying new equipment or hiring a lot more people.
And remember, this whole process is dynamic. So, sixth, you have to embrace continuous improvement. Once you successfully break or elevate one constraint, a new one will inevitably emerge somewhere else in the system. That's not failure, that's progress. You must repeat the process. Go back to step 1, identify the new constraint, and start exploiting, subordinating, and elevating again. Always be looking for the next constraint, because stagnation is the real enemy of progress. It's a cycle, POGI.
Seventh, constantly challenge assumptions. Don't ever accept, well, that's the way it was always done around here. It's a valid reason for anything. Use critical thinking. Relentlessly ask why. Okay, dig deeper to find the intrinsic order beneath the surface chaos. Understand the true cause and effect relationships driving your system's performance.
Eighth, related to that, think beyond your silo. Always try to see how your actions, your department's decisions affect the entire system and other parts of it. Remember Alex realizing production and sales weren't separate worlds, but 2 links in the same chain. Optimizing one function locally at the expense of another, or without considering the impact on the constraint, is almost always self-defeating for the overall goal.
And finally, maybe a softer skill, but just as vital, consider the power of persuasion. Understanding these insights yourself is one thing. Being able to effectively communicate them, to explain the logic, to build consensus, and overcome that natural resistance to change within an organization or even a relationship. That's another equally vital skill needed to make these changes stick.
That's a great summary.
The goal, it really is more than just a business book, isn't it? It's this profound story wrapped in a novel that teaches us how to think systematically, how to question assumptions deeply, and how to find those true leverage points in almost any complex system we face. It empowers you, the listener, to not just do things, but to figure out how to do the right things. The things that truly move you towards your most important goal.
So maybe as you reflect on this deep dive, here's a final thought to leave you with. What's your Herbie right now? What's that one thing, that single constraint that's currently limiting your progress towards your most important goal, whether that's personal or professional, big or small? And once you have an idea what it might be, what's one small creative step you could take, maybe even today, to exploit it, to make sure it's working as effectively as possible? The journey of ongoing improvement, that POGI, it really begins with asking that single focused question. We definitely encourage you to apply this thinking process to your own challenges.